Aroostook Potato Hills, Maine, October 1882. The wind coming down from Canada already had the bite of a whetted knife, a promise of the iron winter to come. On a slope overlooking the rolling fields, cleared with back-breaking labor, a man was building something that made no sense. His name was Thomas O'Brien, and his neighbors thought he was a fool. The other cabins in the settlement were monuments to timber, log walls chinked tight, rising to respectable peaks. Thomas's structure was different. It was low, almost cowering to the earth. Its walls were made of fieldstone, the glacial debris that plagued every farmer's plow, and they rose to a height of only 6 feet. Men had to stoop to enter the doorframe. "It's a sheep pen he's building, not a house," said Phineas Cole, leaning on the split-rail fence that marked his property line. Jedediah Morse, whose hands had hewn half the log cabins in the county, shook his head. "A stone box to bury his family in. The frost will cleave those walls by January." The county surveyor, Cyrus Whitcomb, a man whose opinion carried the weight of mathematics and official paper, was the most vocal. He stood with a group of men near the track, his voice carrying on the crisp air. "The man is Irish, fresh off the boat. He doesn't understand a Maine winter. He's mortaring with lime and horsehair, and capping that stone foolishness with a pile of swamp grass. It's madness." Whitcomb tapped his temple. "Mark my words. A single spark from that chimney, and his family will be under canvas by Candlemas. It's a fire trap built on a foundation of ignorance." Thomas heard them. He heard it all. He simply picked up another granite stone, judged its weight and face, and set it into the double-coursed wall, troweling the gritty, pale mortar around it, with a practiced hand. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He just built. The mockery of the men on the road lasted for an afternoon. The validation of his work would have to last a lifetime. What did this Donegal tie Thatcher, this man of salt spray and windswept rock, understand about conductive layering that the finest timber framers in Maine, men who had battled the northern winter their entire lives, had missed? Stick with me, and I promise you will learn not just how a strange Irish cabin defied one of the most brutal winters on record, but you'll understand the deep physics of heat, air, and insulation that Thomas O'Brien carried in his hands, a knowledge so old it felt like instinct. If you've ever felt a draft in your own home, tell us in the comments where it comes from. You might be surprised by the answer we uncover today. Thomas O'Brien was not a carpenter. He had never felled a tree with the intention of building a wall. He was not a farmer, though he now worked the stubborn, rocky soil of Aroostook County. He was a thatcher, a tie thatcher, from the west coast of Donegal. His trade was not in wood, but in stone and grass, wind and water. His hands knew the heft of granite, the smell of curing bog heath, the precise tension of a tarred marline stitch, pulling a bundle of thatch tight against a purlin. He had spent his life building low, thick-walled cottages that could withstand the gales that screamed in from the Atlantic, houses whose roofs were living things, breathing out moisture while holding in the precious heat of a peat fire. He had come to America with his wife, Chauvin, and their 2 small children, Cormac and Brigid, for a piece of land to call their own. They had arrived the previous autumn, buying a standard-issue log cabin from a family heading west. That first winter was a lesson written in ice. It was a dry, vicious cold that found every gap in the chinking. Chauvin would fetch water from the well, and by the time she reached the cabin door, a skin of ice would have formed in the basin. The metal scoop in the flour bin rang like a cold iron bell when it struck the frozen, packed flour. One morning, heading to the lean-to check on their horse, Thomas found the brass buckles on the animal's blanket had grown so brittle in the cold, they had snapped clean from the stitching. They spent that winter huddled around the stove, feeding it a relentless diet of cordwood, Yet the cold was a physical presence in the room. It lived in the corners. It coated the inside of the windows with a thick, opaque rime. The children slept in their coats, their breath pluming in the frigid air of the loft. Tomas knew they had survived by luck and the sheer volume of wood they burned. He also knew they could not survive another winter like that. He was not fighting the Maine winter with Maine's weapons. He was fighting it with wood, and the wood was losing. The problem wasn't the logs. The problem was physics. The conventional cabins of Aroostook County, for all their rugged beauty, were thermal sieves. A standard log wall, 12 inches thick, had an R value of about 12 to 14. Respectable, but not insurmountable for a Maine winter. The real failure was overhead. The roofs were typically plank sheathing covered with cedar shingles. This assembly had an R value of perhaps 2, maybe 3 on a good day. Heat, as every school child knows, rises. In the log cabins, the massive, heat-radiating cast-iron stoves worked tirelessly to warm the air. That warm air, buoyant and full of energy, rose directly to the ceiling, where it met the pitifully thin barrier of the shingle roof. The heat conducted straight through the wood, warming the shingles just enough to melt the bottom layer of snow, which would then refreeze into a heavy sheet of ice, while the precious warmth bled out into the indifferent, sub-zero sky. The family lived in the bottom few feet of the cabin, in a shallow pool of warmth, while the top of the room was an engine for wasting fuel. To compensate, the settlers burned wood at a furious pace. A family might burn through 20 cords of wood in a single winter, a staggering amount of labor in felling, bucking, splitting, and stacking. The fires raged so hot that the air in the cabin became desperately dry, cracking skin and irritating lungs. Yet 6 feet from the stove, a cup of water could still freeze overnight. The cabins were a paradox of scorching heat and penetrating cold, existing in the same small space. It was a brute force approach to survival, one that measured success by the size of the woodpile. Tomas saw it differently. He saw it not as a battle of heat against cold, but as a challenge of containment. The other settlers were trying to heat the entire state of Maine. Tomas O'Brien intended only to heat his house. His work began in the late summer. He walked his newly purchased acres not with an axe, but with a stone boat and a lever. The very rocks that the other farmers cursed, the granite field stones that broke plowshares, he gathered as treasures. He chose them for their flat faces and predictable shapes, hauling them one by one to his building site. His neighbors watched him, perplexed. He was building his foundation, then his walls, with the rubbish from his fields. The walls rose slowly, meticulously. They were double-coursed, meaning he built 2 parallel walls of stone, one inner and one outer, and filled the gap between them with smaller stones, and a thick, insulating mortar of lime, sand, and horsehair. The lime, which he'd kilned himself, was a better binder than simple clay, and the horsehair gave it tensile strength, preventing the cracking that Jedediah Morse had predicted. The walls were nearly 2 feet thick and stopped at what seemed an absurdly low height, 6 feet. "You'll not stand upright in it, man," Phineas Cole called over one day. Tomas simply nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "A tall room is a cold room," he said, and went back to his work. Chauvin, bringing him a dipper of water, watched the neighbors watching him. "They think you've lost your senses, my love," she said, her voice a low murmur. "It's sense they're lacking," Tomas replied, his eyes on his wall. "They build their houses for pride. I'm building this one for warmth." The strangest part of the construction, the part that drew the most scorn, was the roof. While his neighbors were laying shingles, Tomas was in the marshes and on the untillable high ground with a scythe, cutting bog heath, heather. To the settlers it was useless scrub. To Tomas, it was the finest blanket nature could provide. He cut it, bundled it, and let it cure in the autumn sun. When the stone walls were capped with thick spruce timbers, he began to thatch. It was a craft that looked chaotic, but was as precise as joinery. He bundled the cured heather into tight sheaves called yelms, each about a foot in diameter. Starting at the eaves, he laid the first course, binding each yelm directly to the spruce purlins that formed the roof structure. He used tarred marline, a tough, waterproof cord, and a long, curved steel needle he had forged himself. The stitch was the heart of the craft, a saddle stitch that looped over the purlin and back through the thatch, cinching it down with immense pressure. Each course overlapped the one below it like shingles, but with a thickness and density that wood could never match. Cyrus Whitcomb, the surveyor, made a special trip to witness the spectacle. He brought 2 members of the town council with him. He watched Tomas working his way up the roof, stitching bundle after bundle of what he considered to be kindling. "Mr. O'Brien," Whitcomb called out, his voice full of authority, "I feel it is my civic duty to warn you. What you are building is a menace, a chimney spark, a stray ember on a windy night, and that pile of brush will go up like a torch. You have a wife and children in there. This is reckless." Tomas paused, his needle halfway through a stitch. He looked down at the surveyor. He didn't get angry. He didn't get defensive. He simply replied, "In Donegal, we say a good thatch roof fears water, not fire." He then pulled the stitch tight, the marline groaning with the tension. He knew something Whitcomb, with all his maps and measurements, did not. A properly compressed thatch roof, 14 inches thick, is so dense that it holds very little oxygen. It won't burst into flame. It might smolder for days, giving ample warning. But it would not ignite, like a pile of loose hay. He didn't bother to explain this. He let Whitcomb believe what he wanted. He returned to his work, leaving the surveyor sputtering with indignation to the councilman. The roof grew, course by course, until it formed a thick, brown-gold mantle, 14 inches deep, that hugged the stone walls and hung over them in a deep, protective eave. The secret to Tomas O'Brien's strange house wasn't magic. It was a masterful, intuitive understanding of thermodynamics. Specifically, it was about the power of trapped air and the principle of conductive layering. The entire system was designed to put the most powerful insulation where it mattered most, on top. Let's break down the science. Heat moves in 3 ways: convection, radiation, and conduction. In a frontier cabin, the biggest enemy was conduction, the direct transfer of heat through solid materials. The molecules in the wood of a cabin wall vibrate with heat from the stove, and they pass that energy along, molecule by molecule, until it reaches the outside, where it escapes into the cold air. The measure of a material's resistance to this process is its R value. A higher R value means better insulation. The 6-foot-high, 2-foot-thick fieldstone walls were the first layer of Tomas's system. Stone itself isn't a great insulator, but its sheer mass gives it a high thermal inertia. It heats up and cools down very slowly. The double coursing, with the rubble and lime mortar fill, created pockets of air and a less dense core, slowing conduction significantly. The entire wall assembly had a respectable R value of around 12, far better than a single log wall of the same thickness. But the real genius was the roof. The bog heath, the heather he had so painstakingly harvested and stitched, was a miracle of natural engineering. Each hollow stem of the plant is designed to be lightweight and strong. When bundled and compressed, those hollow stems trap millions of microscopic pockets of air. Air itself is a fantastic insulator, as long as it can't move, and create a convection current. By volume, Tomas's tightly packed thatch was 60% trapped air. 14 inches of this material created an insulating blanket with an R value of R22. This was unheard of in 1882. A modern code-compliant attic in Maine is insulated to R49, but R22 was astronomically better than the R2 of his neighbor's shingle roofs. Here is the crucial point. Tomas had placed his best insulation, the R22 thatch, on top of his good insulation, the R12 stone walls. Because heat rises, it was the roof that faced the greatest thermal pressure. By creating a super-insulated cap on his stone box, he ensured that the vast majority of the heat generated by his small stove would be contained within the living space. The low 6-foot walls were a part of this system. They reduced the total volume of air that needed to be heated and minimized the surface area of the walls, which, despite being well built, were still less insulating than the roof. His house was like a man wearing a very thick hat in winter. It didn't matter how good his coat was if his head was bare. Tomas had given his house the warmest hat in Aroostook County. That winter, the sky turned a strange, brilliant cobalt blue. In late January, a dome of Arctic high pressure settled over northern Maine, and for 9 consecutive days, the temperature never rose above 30 degrees below zero. The old-timers called it an ice blink. There was no new snow, no wind to speak of in the open, just a profound, penetrating, and absolute cold. The existing snow on the ground became so dry that it crinkled underfoot with a sound like crushing glass, a sound that carried for a quarter mile in the still, dense air. Trees cracked in the forest with reports like rifle shots as their sap froze and expanded. It was a winter that tested every nail, every joint, and every soul. For most of the settlers, it was a state of siege. The constant roaring fires in their stoves were barely enough to keep the cabins habitable. Families lived in a small orbit around the heat source, wrapped in blankets. The windows were blind with frost so thick it blocked the weak afternoon light. Phineas Cole's wife, Martha, found her sewing needles were too cold to hold with bare fingers. Jedediah Morse, who had mocked Tomas's stone pen, was burning through his winter woodpile at a terrifying rate. He began eyeing the trees closest to his cabin, calculating if he'd have to start cutting his emergency reserve. The cold was a physical weight, pressing in on the thin shells of wood and chinking, stealing warmth and hope. Inside the low stone house of Tomas O'Brien, a different reality existed. The small wood stove glowed with a gentle, steady heat. It didn't need to be fed constantly. A few logs every few hours kept the interior at a comfortable temperature. There was no frost on the inside of the small, deep-set windows. Chauvin sat in a chair near one of them, mending one of Cormac's shirts in the clear, bright sunlight, her fingers nimble and warm. The children, Cormac and Bridget, were not huddled by the fire. They were playing on a woolen rug in the middle of the floor, building a small tower with blocks of scrap wood. They were in their shirt sleeves. The ultimate proof, the quiet, daily miracle, sat on a simple wooden shelf in the kitchen area. It was a small earthenware pot of butter. Every morning, Chauvin would churn, and the fresh butter would be put in the pot. By noon, in every other cabin in the county, that butter would be a cold, hard brick, impossible to spread. It had to be shaved off in thin curls with a sharp knife and melted in the skillet. But on Chauvin's shelf, the butter was soft. It was spreadable. It yielded to the knife with a gentle, creamy resistance. The air in the house was so consistently warm, so thoroughly protected from the brutal cold just inches away on the other side of the stone and thatch, that it kept the fat in a state of simple, domestic readiness. It was a small thing, a pot of butter, but it was proof that the house was not just a shelter. It was a home. The vindication came on the 7th day of the ice blink. A new county auditor, a man named Elias Davies, was making his way from Presque Isle to Caribou to file a tax case. He was traveling by sleigh, and as he passed the turnoff to the O'Brien property, a sudden ground blizzard kicked up. the wind scouring the dry, crystalline snow from the fields and whipping it into a blinding, stinging curtain of white. The temperature with the wind chill plummeted. Davies, seeing the low, smoking chimney of the strange stone house, decided to seek shelter until the squall passed. He pulled his horse into the lee of the building, sheltering under the deep 2-foot overhang of the thatched eave. The wind howled over the roof, but in the space beneath the eave, the air was almost still. He stamped his feet, trying to bring life back into them. He was a practical man, and he instinctively ran a gloved hand over the building's surfaces, checking for drafts, a habit from years of assessing property. He expected to feel a jet of frigid air where the thick thatch met the top of the stone wall. That joint, in his experience, was always a building's weakest point. He pressed his palm firmly against the seam. He felt nothing. There was no draft, no telltale line of infiltrating cold. More than that, the stone itself, sheltered by the eave, felt not warm but neutral. It wasn't radiating the soul-leeching cold of every other stone structure he had ever touched in a Maine winter. It was just still. Astonished, he pulled off his glove and placed his bare palm on the seam. He expected the instant painful sting of contact with a sub-zero surface. Instead, he felt only the rough texture of the mortar and the surprising lack of cold. It was so profoundly unexpected that he stood there for a long moment, processing the information his senses were giving him. This place was different. It was sealed. Before he even raised his hand to knock on the thick plank door, he did something unconsciously. He unbuttoned the top buttons of his greatcoat. Tomas welcomed him in. The wave of calm, steady warmth that enveloped Davies as he stepped inside was a physical shock. It wasn't the scorching, dry heat of an overworked stove, but a gentle, humid warmth that felt like a spring day. He saw the children playing on the floor. He saw the woman sewing by the window. His eyes, accustomed to the gloom of frost-covered cabins, took a moment to adjust to the bright, clear light. He gratefully accepted a mug of hot tea and explained his situation. As they spoke, Cyrus Whitcomb, the surveyor, arrived on snowshoes, having seen the auditor's sleigh turn in. He was checking on the outlying homesteads, a duty he took seriously. He was bundled to his eyes in wool and fur. He knocked and entered, bringing a blast of frigid air with him. "Mr. Davies, I was worried for you in that squall," he began, then stopped, his gaze sweeping the comfortable scene. He saw the auditor, his coat unbuttoned. He saw the children. His eyes fell on the kitchen shelf, where Siobhan was now slicing a piece of bread from a loaf. She reached for the pot of butter. Whitcomb watched, his skepticism a hard shield, as she dipped the knife in and pulled out a soft, yielding dollop, spreading it effortlessly across the bread. He couldn't help himself. "Your butter? It is not frozen?" Siobhan smiled. "No, sir. The house does not allow it." Tomas offered the surveyor a piece of bread. Whitcomb took it. He bit into it. The taste of the soft butter, melting slightly on the warm bread, was the final, undeniable piece of evidence. It was a sensation of impossible summer comfort in the heart of a winter that was freezing the very marrow in men's bones. He looked from the butter to the thatched ceiling, then to the thick stone walls. The certainty he had carried for months, the confident derision of an expert, crumbled into dust. He looked at Tomas O'Brien, a man he had publicly called a fool. You did not build a fortress, Mr. O'Brien," Whitcomb said, his voice quiet with awe. "You built a living thing." The story of the county auditor and the spreadable butter became a local legend. When the great cold broke, men who had scoffed at Tomas's sheep pen came by, hats in hand, to ask questions. Tomas, a man of few words, answered not with theories, but with simple demonstrations. He showed them the saddle stitch. He let them feel the density of the thatch. He explained how the hollow stems of the heather worked. He never once mentioned their mockery. He simply shared what he knew. The following year, in the autumn of 1883, Tomas was persuaded to enter a model of his roof design in the first Aroostook County Winter Build exhibit. His small, perfectly thatched model sat next to elaborate designs for improved log notching and newfangled stovepipes. It won a blue ribbon for ingenuity in native materials. The real victory, however, came not from the ribbon, but from the audience. In attendance were 3 young agricultural students from the University of Maine in Orono. They were there to study barn construction and silo design, but they were mesmerized by the Irish thatcher's work. They spent 2 hours with Tomas, sketching furiously in their notebooks, asking precise questions about the curing time of the heath, the composition of the mortar, the tension of the stitches. They transcribed the entire saddle stitch process, complete with diagrams. That winter, their notebooks became the source material for a pamphlet distributed at the 1884 Grange meetings across northern Maine. It was titled The O'Brien Thatch, a method for constructing a warm roof with local materials. The idea began to spread. It wasn't a revolution. Timber was still king. But by the spring of 1885, a dozen homesteads, mostly newer ones built by families without the capital for a full timber cabin, featured low stone walls and thick thatched roofs. Farmers began to look at the useless scrub on their high ground in a new light. The fuel savings were dramatic. Families reported cutting their wood consumption by more than half, freeing up weeks of labor for other vital tasks. The knowledge, once the secret of a Donegal village, was now part of the practical wisdom of the Maine frontier. What Tomas O'Brien accomplished on that windswept hill was more than just building a warm house. He was a century ahead of his time. He was practicing principles that modern building science would not formalize until the energy crises of the 1970s. Concepts like a super-insulated building envelope, putting outsolation on a structure, and the critical importance of a high R-value roof are now standard practice in high-performance construction. His R22 roof would meet or exceed the code requirements for roof insulation in many parts of the United States today. He had created a passive system that worked with nature, not against it, using local, sustainable materials to solve the most pressing problem of his time. The frontier was a place that stripped away pretense. It didn't care about a man's accent, his credentials, or the conventional wisdom of the community. It rewarded what worked. The other settlers had tried to fight the cold with more fire. They saw the winter as an enemy to be assaulted with brute force. Tomas saw it differently. He didn't see an enemy. He saw a powerful natural system that had to be understood and accommodated. His house didn't fight the cold. It ignored it. It created a pocket of calm, stable warmth that was simply unbothered by the fury outside. His neighbors thought he was building a wall and a roof, but what he was really doing was creating a membrane, a skin as clever as an animal's fur. Cyrus Whitcomb, in his moment of conversion, had come close to the truth when he called it a living thing. The house was a quiet testament to an older, deeper wisdom. He didn't build a roof on top of a wall. He gave the stone a head of hair to breathe through. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If you found this story of ingenuity and resilience valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more tales of forgotten pioneers. Let us know in the comments what other historical building techniques you find fascinating. We read every one. Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the building techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building method today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.